you are loved with an everlasting love. That's what the Bible says, and underneath are the everlasting arms. We've been talking about the two young men, Jim Elliot and Pete Fleming, who were en route to their life's goal, missionary work in Ecuador. Jim was from Portland, Oregon. He believed that God was calling him into linguistic work in the jungles, and he had been praying for some time for a companion so that he could go 2 by 2 as Jesus had sent out the disciples back in New Testament days. And the answer to his prayer was Pete Fleming, a young man with a master's degree in literature from the University of Washington. And so the two men sailed from California in February of 1952. After 18 days at sea, they arrived in Guayaquil, the port city of Ecuador, and about halfway up the Guayas River, Pete wrote, "I finally comprehended that this was Ecuador. I felt a tingling sensation for the first time. Jim and I sang quietly, 'Faith of our fathers,' as the boat pulled into the harbor. 'Faith of our fathers, holy faith, we will be true to thee till death.'" We've been mentioning the fact that God has a story which He's writing in the lives of every one of us. He's the author. We are the characters in the story. We don't know what the ending is going to be. We have no idea what's going to happen in the next chapter. And many times God's story has surprise endings and many excitements. But it also has a good many routine, ordinary days. If we were to write the story of our lives, including every day, a good many of those days would be pretty boring. Have you ever looked back over any of your old diaries and find out that it's very boring after all? Well, we go from point A to point B to point C to point D, and nothing at all seems to be happening. But the things which were going on in Jim and Pete's lives at this point were very exciting. They had just arrived in Guayaquil, and here they were looking at all these strange sights. The tide was coming in. The masses of water hyacinths were riding swiftly upriver, the Guayas River. There was a huge white fruit ship standing at anchor, and beside it the barges and long, slim dugout canoes of the banana vendors. On the wharf stood stacks and stacks of bananas to be exported to the United States and other places. A ferry was disgorging sweating, shouting multitudes with their straw suitcases and cloth bundles and chickens and baskets and pineapples, and Jim and Pete stopped to watch the faces. Businessmen, dressed in crisp white suits and Panama hats, were coming out of buildings for the 2-hour lunch break, and fancy cars were nudging donkeys for the right-of-way in the streets. It was a land of contrasts. They had to spend several days in a third-class hotel where there were heat, mosquitoes, and a lot of noise. The bray of a burro, or a donkey, woke them up the first morning, and they had to go to the customs office several times in order to clear their baggage, which had come up the river from the freighter by barge. Their goal was to go to Quito, the capital city of Ecuador, where they were going to start learning Spanish. And so they were very impatient as they waited in Guayaquil for the clearing of their baggage. They took a plane to Quito, traveling up over the western cordillera of the Andes, crossing a 13,000-foot pass, and landing in the capital. Quito is 9,300 feet above sea level, and to the west rises the volcanic mountain Pichincha. To the east are even higher snowcaps. Here was a new opportunity to live to the hilt. Jim had written in his diary, "Wherever you are, be all there. Live to the hilt, every situation you believe to be the will of God." I, too, had taken a boat to Ecuador subsequent to Jim and Pete's arrival, but I remember very well the agony of waiting for almost 10 days for my baggage, and then the tremendous relief of getting out of the heat and steam of Guayaquil, the port city, up into the high, clear atmosphere of Quito, a beautiful city, a colonial city with cobblestone streets, beautiful white stucco buildings with geraniums in window boxes, and an old world atmosphere. There were also the smells and the slums and the rotting banana peels in certain sections, but generally speaking, it is a beautiful city, and Jim and Pete threw heart and soul into the learning of Spanish. For the first month or so, they lived with Dr. Tidmarsh and his wife, which was not an ideal situation for learning Spanish, but when they learned that it was possible to find a room in a non-English speaking house, that's what they did. They moved in with a family called Ceballos, and no one in that household spoke English. So they were learning Spanish by what's called the immersion method. It was amazing the speed with which they learned the language. Jim had done a very wise thing before he went to Ecuador. He had spent 2 summers working with a missionary family in Mexico. This was back in the days before anybody had thought of summer programs for kids. Jim thought it up all by himself and had hitchhiked to Mexico and learned quite a bit of Spanish in the 6 weeks that he was there for each of 2 years. But Pete did not know any Spanish. They signed up with a Spanish-speaking señorita who began formal lessons. And it was not very long after their arrival that I also arrived in Ecuador as a brand new missionary with another woman from Texas. Dorothy Jones and I had a house right across the street where we rented a room and ate our meals and learned Spanish with a family named Arias. Then, when the time came that the men felt they had learned sufficient Spanish to get along, they moved down into what is called the Oriente, the eastern jungle, taking a bus from the city of Quito. It's called a bus. It's not exactly what you would call a comfortable one. It doesn't look anything like the Greyhound or Trailways buses of this country. The seats were made of boards about 10 inches deep, and the back of the seat was a board about 10 inches high. There were chickens and pineapples and all sorts of things in the bus with them. And there were delays. One of the things that we learned about bus trips in Ecuador was that they either stopped for nothing or they wouldn't stop for anything. Sometimes the driver would turn off the ignition in order to save gas as the bus careened down the, let's see, how many foot drop was it? About 10,000 feet. After you went up to the high pass of 12,000 feet, then you had to drop down into the eastern jungle, and that was a rather hair-raising trip. Ambato was the city called the gateway to the Oriente, where they changed buses and then dropped down from there very precipitously through the Pastaza Gorge and to the little town of Shelmera, which was the gateway to the jungle and the place where the Missionary Aviation Fellowship had their base. There were hairpin turns on the road, there were orchids hanging over the road, many things which caught their attention, which they put down in their journals and in their letters. Jim and Pete spent the night in Nate and Marge Saint's house, the Missionary Aviation Base, a house which Nate Saint had built, and he flew them the following day into a station called Pano, which was manned by the Christian Missionary Alliance, and from Pano they walked over the trail to Shandia. Shandia was their life's goal, the place where Dr. Tidmarsh had been working, and he met them in Pano and led them over the trail, which was very muddy, into Shandia. Jim wrote about the mud, up to their knees at times, the roots, the buttress-shaped roots of tremendously tall jungle trees, and the umbrella of trees which made the jungle rather a dark place. He noticed colored fungus, flowers, the delicious smells of flowers high up in the trees that they couldn't even see. And just as the moon rose, they broke into the station of Shandia. There was a little thatched house there, a supper of rice soup prepared by Dr. Tidmarsh's Indian helper, plantain, manioc, rice, and coffee. The only light was a kerosene lamp, And Jim sat down by the kerosene lamp that night and wrote a description of that trip in his journal. God has a story which he's writing in the lives of every one of us. And many times God's story has surprise endings and many excitements. But it also has a good many routine, ordinary days.
Gateway to Joy program 83 and Point A to Point B.